The first shot shattered the stained glass window of St. Mary's Church at exactly 11:30 on a Sunday morning, just as Reverend Michael Cross was delivering his sermon about forgiveness and redemption. The bullet passed so close to his head that he felt its heat, embedding itself in the wooden cross behind the pulpit with a sound like divine judgment. The congregation hit the floor as one, children crying, women screaming, men reaching for guns they'd left at home out of respect for the Lord's house. But Reverend Cross didn't duck. He didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly set down his Bible, walked to the altar, and lifted a loose floorboard to reveal something that made even the bravest men in his flock gasp in shock. A pair of ivory-handled Colt .45s, their barrels worn smooth from years of use. Gun belts that had seen more blood than most battlefields. And a badge, a U.S. Marshal's star that had been hidden beneath holy vestments for 3 long years. "Children," Reverend Cross said in a voice suddenly harder than desert stone, "I believe services are concluded for today." The man who'd spent 3 years preaching about turning the other cheek was gone. In his place stood someone the good people of Salvation Creek had never seen before, someone whose past was written in gunpowder and regret, someone who tried to bury his demons in scripture and prayer, but found that some sins refused to stay buried. As he strapped on the guns with movements as fluid as water, the congregation saw the truth written in his eyes. Their gentle preacher was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Someone with blood on his hands and devils at his heels. And those devils had finally found him. Before we dive into how a man of God became a man of violence, and how the past has a way of demanding payment in full, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button because this tale of faith, redemption, and the prices we pay for our sins is just beginning. 3 years earlier, Marshal William Cross had been the best manhunter in 5 territories. Fast with a gun, faster with his mind, he'd brought in more wanted men than any other federal officer west of the Mississippi. He was known for 3 things: never missing a target, never giving up a chase, and never bringing in a prisoner who tried to draw on him. That last part wasn't because William Cross was particularly merciful. It was because dead men don't draw guns. The transformation from killer to preacher had begun in a dusty street in Tombstone, where Cross had cornered Danny Reeves, a young rustler with more courage than sense. The boy couldn't have been older than 17, barely old enough to shave, but he'd stolen cattle from the wrong ranch and killed a man in the process. "Don't make me do this, son," Cross had said, his hand hovering over his gun. "Drop your weapon and walk away." But Danny Reeves was scared and desperate, and scared men make poor decisions. He'd gone for his gun with the speed of youth and the inevitability of tragedy. Cross's draw was faster, his aim truer, and Danny Reeves died in the dust with his mother's name on his lips. It was the 37th man Cross had killed in the line of duty. The number had stopped meaning anything to him years ago, just another notch on his reputation, another story for saloon patrons to exaggerate and embellish. But something about the boy's death broke something inside him, something he hadn't even known was still whole. That night, Cross had sat in his hotel room staring at his guns, seeing not instruments of justice, but tools of destruction. He'd become so good at killing that he'd forgotten why he'd started carrying a badge in the first place. Justice had become vengeance, law had become personal satisfaction, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing the people he hunted as human beings. The badge had gone into a drawer, the guns into a chest, and William Cross had disappeared into the wilderness to wrestle with demons that had no names and sins that had no forgiveness. He'd wandered for months, working odd jobs, drinking too much, trying to find some way to live with what he'd become. The answer had come in a small mission church in New Mexico, where an old priest named Father Santos had taken in a broken man and slowly helped him remember what it meant to be human. "Violence begets violence," the old priest had said. "But mercy begets mercy, and love begets love. Which legacy do you want to leave, my son?" Cross had found his answer in Scripture, in prayer, in the slow process of learning to help instead of hurt. When Father Santos died 2 years later, he'd left Cross a letter and the deed to a small church in a town called Salvation Creek. "Build something beautiful," the letter had said. "Turn your gift for reading men's souls towards salvation instead of destruction." And so William Cross had become Reverend Michael Cross, burying his guns beneath the altar, and his past beneath layers of good works and genuine faith. He'd married couples, baptized children, comforted the dying, and slowly built a community that believed in redemption and second chances. For 3 years it had worked. The nightmares had faded, the constant awareness of danger had dimmed, and Cross had begun to believe that a man could truly change his nature through faith and determination. Now, standing in his bullet-shattered church with his congregation staring at him in shock, he realized how naive that belief had been. Reverend Sarah Martinez, the church organist, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you really?" Cross finished buckling his gun belt and turned to face the people who'd trusted him with their spiritual welfare. They deserved the truth, even if it destroyed everything he'd built. "My name is William Cross. I was a federal marshal for 12 years. I've killed 37 men in the line of duty." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I came here to escape that life, to become something better. But it seems my past isn't ready to let me go." An older man named Tom Bradley stepped forward, his weathered face showing confusion and hurt. "You lied to us. For 3 years, you've been living a lie." "No," Cross said firmly. "For 3 years, I've been trying to become the man I should have been all along. Michael Cross isn't a lie. He's who William Cross was meant to be before violence and anger poisoned his soul." Another shot shattered a different window, this one accompanied by a voice calling from outside. "William Cross, we know you're in there. Come out and face what you've done." Cross moved to the window, keeping low, and peered out at the street. For men on horseback, all heavily armed, all wearing the hard expressions of professional killers. He recognized 2 of them, Jake Morrison and Clyde Waters, bounty hunters who worked for whoever paid them best. But it was the 3rd man who made Cross's blood run cold. Thomas Brennan, the brother of a man Cross had killed 5 years ago. A man who'd sworn vengeance and apparently spent years tracking down the Marshal who destroyed his family. "Tom Brennan," Cross muttered. "Should have known." "Friend of yours?" Tom Bradley asked, his tone sarcastic. "Brother of a man I killed. Bank robber named Pete Brennan. He drew on me and I shot him." Cross checked his guns, muscle memory taking over despite 3 years of disuse. "Tom swore he'd hunt me down and make me pay. And now he's here. Now he's here." Cross looked around at his congregation. Good people, honest people, who'd never asked for this kind of violence to invade their sanctuary. There were children among them, women who'd never seen gunplay except in their nightmares. "Everyone out the back," he ordered. "Get to your homes and stay inside until this is over." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to end this one way or another. By killing them." Tom Bradley's voice held accusation and disappointment. "Is that your solution to everything, Reverend? More violence?" Cross paused, the question hitting him like a physical blow. He'd spent 3 years learning to turn the other cheek, to solve problems with words instead of bullets. But Tom Brennan hadn't come here for a theological debate. He'd come for blood, and he'd keep killing until he got it. "Sometimes," Cross said quietly, "violence is the only language evil men understand." That's Marshal Cross talking, not Reverend Cross. Maybe they're the same man after all. As his congregation filed out through the back door, Cross remained alone in his church, surrounded by broken glass and bullet holes. The altar where he'd preached about love and forgiveness now served as cover for men who wanted him dead. Through the shattered window, he could see Tom Brennan dismounting from his horse. The man looked older than Cross remembered, his face marked by years of hatred and obsession. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about a man who'd let the desire for vengeance consume his entire life. "Cross," Brennan called. "I know you can hear me. 5 years I've been hunting you. 5 years of tracking down every lead, every rumor, every whisper of where the great William Cross might have gone to ground." Cross said nothing, watching as Brennan's men spread out to cover all the church's exits. Professional work, the kind of tactical thinking that suggested military experience. "You know why I'm here." Brennan continued. "You know what you owe me. My brother wasn't a bad man, just desperate, just trying to feed his family. But you gunned him down like a rabid dog." It wasn't true, and Cross knew it. Pete Brennan had been a career criminal with 3 murders to his name, a man who'd shown no mercy to the bank customers he'd terrorized. But truth and perception were often different things, especially when grief and anger had years to fester. "Come out and face me like a man," Brennan shouted. "Or are you going to hide behind that collar like the coward you really are?" Cross checked his ammunition. 12 rounds in the cylinders, another dozen on his belt. Against 4 armed men, it would have to be enough. He'd been faster than them once, more accurate, more ruthless. The question was whether 3 years of peace had dulled those deadly skills. There was only one way to find out. Cross walked to the front door of his church, his boots loud on the wooden floor. The handle felt cold under his palm, and for a moment he hesitated. Once he stepped through that door, Reverend Michael Cross would be gone forever. There would be only William Cross, the killer, the manhunter, the demon he'd tried so hard to bury. But sometimes a man had to embrace his demons to protect the things he loved. Cross opened the door and stepped into the street, his hands hanging loose at his sides, ready to draw. The four men turned to face him, and he saw something he hadn't expected in their eyes. Fear. Word of William Cross's reputation had spread far and wide, apparently. Even after 3 years, the name still carried weight among men who made their living with guns. Well, well, Brennan said, his voice trying for confidence but not quite achieving it. The famous William Cross. Heard you'd gone soft, turned preacher. Looks like you found your guns again. Tom, Cross said calmly, you've come a long way for this. You sure it's worth dying for? My brother's blood demands justice. Your brother got justice. He drew on a federal marshal and paid the price. Same as any other outlaw. Brennan's face flushed red with anger. He was a good man who made bad choices. You didn't have to kill him. Yes, I did. Because if I hadn't, he would have killed me, then probably killed half a dozen other people before someone else put him down. Cross's voice carried the weight of hard experience. I didn't enjoy it, Tom, but I don't regret it either. Well, you're going to regret it now. Brennan's hand moved toward his gun, and time seemed to slow as Cross's instincts took over. The Marshal's draw was smooth as silk, faster than thought, precise as a prayer. His first shot took Brennan in the chest before the man's gun had cleared leather. The other 3 men went for their weapons simultaneously, but Cross was already moving, rolling to his left as bullets whined through the space where he'd been standing. His second shot dropped Jake Morrison, his third wounded Clyde Waters. The 4th man, a stranger Cross didn't recognize, got off a shot that burned across the Marshal's shoulder before Cross's bullet found its mark. The gunman stumbled backward and fell, his weapon spinning away across the dusty street. Silence settled over Salvation Creek like a shroud. For men lay dead or dying in the street outside the church, while William Cross stood among them with smoking guns in his hands. Just like old times. The first people to emerge from hiding were his congregation, drawn by the sudden cessation of gunfire. They gathered at a respectful distance, staring at their preacher with a mixture of awe and fear. Is it over? Sarah asked. Cross looked down at Tom Brennan's body, seeing not an enemy, but a man destroyed by his own hatred. For now. What happens next? It was a good question. Word would spread about what had happened here. Other enemies would come, other men seeking revenge or reputation. Salvation Creek would never be safe as long as William Cross was here. I pack my bags and move on, Cross said, holstering his guns. This town deserves better than a preacher with blood on his hands. No. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his earlier anger replaced by something that might have been understanding. This town deserves a man willing to fight for it when fighting's needed. Cross looked around at the faces of his congregation, people he'd baptized, married, comforted in their grief. They were looking at him differently now, seeing both the killer and the preacher, understanding perhaps that sometimes the two weren't so different. You knew who I was, Cross realized. Some of you anyway. Tom Bradley nodded. Figured it out after the first year. A man doesn't learn to read souls the way you do without seeing a lot of dark ones. And your hands. He gestured toward Cross's callous palms. Those aren't preacher's hands. Why didn't you say anything? Because it didn't matter. Michael Cross was real, even if his past was William Cross. You helped us, healed us, made us better people. That's what counted. Cross felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. And now. Sarah stepped forward, her organist's hands surprisingly steady as she reached for his arm. Now you're still our preacher. Just one who happens to be very good with a gun. As the town's undertaker began the grim work of dealing with the bodies, Cross walked back into his church. The broken windows would need to be replaced, the bullet holes would need to be filled, but the foundation was still solid. Like the man who served as its shepherd, the church had weathered the storm and remained standing. But Cross knew this was just the beginning. Word of this gunfight would spread, and other men would come seeking the legendary William Cross. The question was whether Salvation Creek was strong enough to weather the storms ahead. Looking at his congregation as they began cleaning up the damage, Cross thought it just might be. The telegram arrived 3 days after the gunfight, carried by a nervous young man who'd ridden hard from the nearest railroad depot 20 miles away. Cross read it twice before the full implications sank in. Heard about Brennan stop Judge Hawthorne murdered stop witnesses, say you did it stop Army patrol coming stop run stop. Murphy had been Cross's deputy during his Marshal days, one of the few honest lawmen in a territory riddled with corruption. If he was warning Cross to run, the situation was even worse than it appeared. Judge Hawthorne had been the territorial magistrate who'd originally sentenced Pete Brennan to hang. He was also a corrupt politician who'd taken bribes from cattle barons and mining companies for years. His murder would normally be cause for celebration among honest citizens, but someone was using it to frame William Cross for a crime he hadn't committed. Bad news? Tom Bradley asked, noticing Cross's expression as he read the telegram for a third time. The worst kind. Someone's trying to pin a murder on me, and they've got enough influence to send federal troops after me. Cross explained about Judge Hawthorne's death and the accusations being leveled against him. As he spoke, he could see the fear returning to his congregation's faces. They just accepted having a gunfighter for a preacher, and now they were learning he was a wanted man. Could you have done it? Sarah asked quietly. Killed this judge? I could have, Cross admitted. Hawthorne was corrupt, bought and paid for by men who treated the law like a convenience. If I was still Marshal Cross, I might have been tempted. But you didn't. No. I've been here for 3 years, and half the town can vouch for that. Tom Bradley stroked his beard thoughtfully. Doesn't matter what we can vouch for if federal troops are already on their way. They'll arrest you first and ask questions later. Cross nodded grimly. The telegram meant his peaceful life in Salvation Creek was over, regardless of his innocence. He could run, disappear into Mexico, or the deep wilderness, but that would mean abandoning the people who'd become his family. Or he could stay and fight both the false charges and whoever was orchestrating this frame job. There's something else, Cross said, making a decision that would change everything. Judge Hawthorne wasn't just corrupt, he was blackmailing people. Had files on half the important men in the territory, including evidence of murder, theft, and conspiracy. How do you know that? Because I helped gather some of that evidence back when I was a marshal. Hawthorne claimed he needed it to prosecute criminals, but I suspected he was using it for personal gain. The implications hit Tom Bradley immediately. You think someone killed him to get those files? Or to destroy them? Either way, Hawthorne's death isn't about justice, it's about covering up other crimes. Cross walked to the window, scanning the horizon for signs of approaching soldiers. The Army patrol could arrive any time, and he needed to decide whether to face them or flee. There's a third option, Sarah said suddenly. What if we find out who really killed Judge Hawthorne? Clear your name and expose the real criminal. It was an appealing idea, but Cross knew how dangerous it would be. That would mean going back to my old life, hunting killers and corrupt officials. It would put everyone in this town at risk. More risk than harboring a wanted fugitive. Tom Bradley asked pointedly. Cross had to admit the logic was sound. Staying and doing nothing would make Salvation Creek complicit in hiding a federal fugitive. But actively investigating Hawthorne's murder would turn the town into a base of operations for William Cross's return to manhunting. If I do this, Cross said slowly, there's no going back. Once word gets out that William Cross is active again, every enemy I've ever made will come looking for me. Then we better make sure you solve this case quick, Tom Bradley said with grim humor. Cross spent the next hour studying the telegram and thinking through what he knew about Judge Hawthorne's operations. The judge had maintained offices in 3 different towns, used multiple banks to hide his assets, and employed a network of informants and enforcers to gather blackmail material. Most importantly, he'd kept detailed records of everything. If someone had killed him for those records, they'd need access to his private safe, which was located in his home, rather than his official courthouse office. I need to get to Hawthorne's house before the Army gets here, Cross decided. If I can find evidence of who broke into his safe, I might be able to identify the real killer. How far is it? Sarah asked. 40 miles. A hard day's ride if I push my horse. Then you better get moving. Cross gathered supplies quickly, food, water, ammunition, and the tools he'd need to examine a crime scene. As he saddled his horse, the congregation gathered to see him off. What if the Army patrol comes while you're gone? Tom Bradley asked. Tell them I headed for Mexico. That should buy me a few days before they realize I'm still in the territory. And if you don't come back? Cross paused in checking his saddle straps. Then someone else will have to take over services on Sunday. It was meant to be a joke, but nobody laughed. They all understood that Cross was riding toward danger that might get him killed or captured. The peaceful preacher was becoming a fugitive, and there was no guarantee he'd survive the transformation. As Cross rode out of Salvation Creek, he could feel the weight of his guns at his hips and the burden of his past on his shoulders. For 3 years, he'd been Michael Cross, man of God. Now he was William Cross again, manhunter and killer, riding toward confrontation with enemies who'd rather see him dead than exposed. The sun was setting behind him as he pushed his horse toward Judge Hawthorne's estate, and Cross couldn't help thinking it might be the last sunset he'd see as a free man. The trail ahead was dark and uncertain, marked by the kind of danger that had driven him from his badge 3 years ago. But this time, he wasn't hunting strangers for money or reputation. This time, he was fighting for the people he'd come to love and the life he'd built among them. The ride through the desert night gave Cross time to think about Judge Hawthorne and the corruption network he'd both served and exploited. The judge had been clever, taking bribes from multiple sources and playing various criminal organizations against each other. But that same cleverness had made him enemies among powerful people who didn't appreciate being blackmailed. Any one of a dozen cattle barons, mining executives, or political bosses could have ordered his death. Cross reached the judge's estate just before dawn, approaching carefully through the scrub brush that surrounded the property. The house was dark, apparently empty, but he could see signs that it had been searched recently, overturned furniture visible through the windows, papers scattered on the front porch. Someone had definitely been here looking for something, and they hadn't been subtle about it. Cross tied his horse in a grove of cottonwoods and approached the house on foot, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The front door was standing open, hanging crookedly on its hinges, as if it had been forced. Inside, the house was a wreck. Every room had been systematically searched, every piece of furniture overturned, every drawer pulled out and emptied. Whoever had done this was looking for something specific, and they'd been willing to destroy everything else to find it. The judge's study had received the most attention. The safe in the corner stood open, its contents scattered across the floor. Cross knelt beside the scattered papers, examining them by lamplight. Financial records, correspondence, legal documents, all the normal business of a territorial judge. But nothing that looked like blackmail material, nothing that would have been worth killing for. Which meant either the killer had found what they were looking for, or Judge Hawthorne had been smarter than anyone realized. Cross spent an hour going through the wreckage, looking for clues about who might have broken in. He found boot prints that suggested at least 3 different men, scuff marks on the safe that indicated professional safecracking tools, and most telling of all, a button that had been torn from an expensive coat. The button was made of silver and bore the engraved initials RK. Cross pocketed it, along with several other items that might prove useful. As he prepared to leave, Cross heard the sound of approaching horses. He moved to the window and saw a group of riders cresting the hill that led to the estate, federal troops, at least a dozen of them, riding hard toward the house. Cross had minutes before they arrived, not enough time to reach his horse without being seen. He needed a hiding place, somewhere he could wait for the soldiers to search the house and leave. The root cellar was his best option, a stone-lined chamber beneath the kitchen that had been designed to keep food cool during the hot desert summers. Cross slipped into the underground space just as the soldiers reached the front yard. Through the floorboards above him, he could hear boots on the wooden floors, voices giving orders, furniture being moved around. The troops were conducting their own search of the house, looking for evidence that William Cross had been there. "Lieutenant," one of the soldiers called. "Someone's been here recently." Still warm ashes in the fireplace, lamp oil still burning in the study. "How recent?" The officer's voice was crisp with authority. "Can't be more than an hour. Whoever it was, they're probably still in the area." Cross closed his eyes, knowing his situation had just become much more dangerous. If the soldiers expanded their search to include the outbuildings and grounds, they'd find his horse. And once they found the horse, they'd know he was hiding somewhere nearby. "Spread out and search the property," the lieutenant ordered. "Check every building, every hiding place. If Cross is here, I want him found." Cross settled into wait, knowing that patience might be the only thing standing between him and a federal prison cell. The root cellar was dark and cramped, but it was also well concealed and unlikely to be discovered unless someone was specifically looking for it. Above him, the search continued for what felt like hours. Soldiers tramped through every room, examined every closet, even checked the chimney. but none of them thought to look for a hidden cellar beneath the kitchen floor. Finally, the sounds of searching died away, replaced by the lieutenant's voice giving orders to mount up and continue the pursuit. Cross waited until the hoofbeats had faded completely before emerging from his hiding place. The soldiers had left the house in even worse condition than they'd found it, if that was possible. But they'd also left something valuable, their own assumptions about where William Cross might be hiding. From their conversation, Cross had learned that the Army Patrol was planning to search a series of abandoned mining camps to the south, assuming he was fleeing toward Mexico. That would give him at least 2 days before they realized their mistake and doubled back. 2 days to identify Judge Hawthorne's real killer and clear his name. Cross retrieved his horse and rode hard toward the nearest town where he might find answers about the silver button and the men who'd searched the judge's house. The trail was getting cold, but it wasn't completely dead yet. And William Cross had never given up on a trail, no matter how difficult the tracking became. The town of Cedar Ridge sat at the junction of 2 cattle trails, a place where ranchers, miners, and drifters converged to spend their money on supplies, liquor, and other diversions. Cross rode in at midday, his collar turned up and his hat pulled low to avoid recognition. The first stop was the general store, where he hoped to learn something about the silver button he'd found at Judge Hawthorne's house. The merchant, a thin man named Peterson, examined the button with professional interest. "Fine workmanship," Peterson said, turning the silver piece over in his hands. "Custom-made, I'd say. These initials, RK, they're hand-engraved by someone who knew their business. Any idea who might have made it? Could be several craftsmen in the territory, but this style looks like the work of Martinez down in Silver City. He specializes in custom silver work for wealthy customers." Silver City was 50 miles south, a hard ride but not impossible. Cross thanked Peterson and was preparing to leave when the merchant called after him. "You know, I've seen buttons like this before. About a week ago, a man came through town wearing a coat with similar silver buttons. Rich fellow, well-dressed, riding with a small crew of hard-looking men." Cross felt his pulse quicken. "Can you describe him?" "Tall, gray-haired, expensive clothes. Had the look of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. His men called him Mr. Kane." "R.K. Robert Kane, perhaps." Cross made a mental note to investigate that name as he rode toward Silver City. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but he still needed more evidence to prove his innocence. The ride to Silver City took him through some of the most desolate country in the territory, rocky canyons, dry creek beds, and mesas that rose like monuments to loneliness. Cross pushed his horse hard, knowing that every hour he spent traveling was an hour the real killer had to cover his tracks. He reached Silver City as the sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson. The town was larger than Cedar Ridge, prosperous from the silver mines that gave it its name. Cross found Martinez's shop on a side street near the Mexican quarter. The silversmith was an elderly man with steady hands and sharp eyes. He examined the button carefully, nodding as he recognized his own work. "See, I made this. Part of a set for a coat, very expensive commission. The customer paid in gold, wanted everything done quickly." "Can you describe the customer?" "Tall Anglo, well-dressed, gray hair. He said his name was Kane, Robert Kane. Claimed to be a cattle buyer from Kansas, but—" Martinez shrugged. He had the look of a man more familiar with taking cattle than buying them. "When was this?" 6 months ago, maybe 7. He ordered 20 buttons, said he might need replacements for his coat." Cross felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Kane had been planning something for months, something that required having extra buttons to replace any that might be lost during the commission of crimes. Did he say anything else? Mention where he was staying, who he worked for? Martinez was quiet. For a moment, clearly debating whether to trust Cross with additional information. Finally, he made a decision. He mentioned working for someone important, someone who needed certain problems solved quietly. And he asked about getting silver conchos made for his men's gun belts, said they were going to be doing special work that required them to look respectable. It was the kind of detail that could break a case wide open. Cross thanked Martinez and left the shop, his mind racing with possibilities. Kane wasn't just a hired killer. He was someone's private enforcer, tasked with eliminating threats to his employer's interests. Judge Hawthorne had been blackmailing powerful people throughout the territory. Any one of them might have hired Kane to eliminate the judge and retrieve the blackmail evidence. Cross needed to find out more about Robert Kane and who employed him. The best place to start was the local saloon where information flowed as freely as whiskey. The Silver Dollar Saloon was crowded with miners, cowboys, and the usual collection of drifters and gamblers who gravitated toward frontier boom towns. Cross ordered whiskey and listened to the conversations around him, picking up fragments of information about local politics and criminal activity. It didn't take long to hear Kane's name mentioned. Apparently, he'd been through Silver City several times over the past year, always with the same crew of hard men, always spending money freely and asking questions about local business. Kane works for the Territorial Development Company, a drunk miner confided to Cross. Big outfit, lots of political connections. They've been buying up land all over the territory, sometimes using methods that ain't exactly legal. The Territorial Development Company, Cross had heard that name before, usually in connection with land disputes and suspicious deaths. If Kane worked for them, it explained both his resources and his willingness to commit murder for hire. Cross was considering his next move when a commotion near the saloon's entrance caught his attention. 3 men had entered, all wearing the kind of expensive clothes that marked them as outsiders. More importantly, all 3 wore gun belts with silver conchos that matched the description Martinez had given him. Kane's men still in Silver City. Cross kept his head down and continued nursing his whiskey, listening as the newcomers ordered drinks and began talking among themselves. Their conversation was loud enough to be overheard, probably deliberately so. "Boss wants us back in Socorro tomorrow," one of them said. "Got another job lined up, something about a preacher who's been causing trouble." Cross's blood ran cold. They were talking about him, about returning to finish what they'd started when they framed him for Hawthorne's murder. "Thought we'd already dealt with the preacher problem," another man replied. "Heard the army was hunting him for killing the judge." Apparently not good enough. Boss wants to make sure the preacher doesn't have a chance to prove his innocence. Says too much is riding on this to take any chances. The third man laughed coldly. "Won't be the first preacher we've sent to meet his maker. Remember that missionary down in Tucson? Thought he could protect some Mexican families from having their land stolen. Learned different when we paid him a visit." Cross felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. These men had just confessed to multiple murders, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, he finished his drink and slipped out of the saloon through the back entrance. If Kane's men were leaving for Socorro tomorrow, Cross needed to reach Salvation Creek first and warn his congregation about the danger they were in. But first, he had one more stop to make. The Silver City Telegraph office was still open, operated by a young clerk who looked half asleep at his key. Cross wrote out a message addressed to his old partner Murphy, now serving as a deputy marshal in Santa Fe. "Kane and TDC behind Hawthorne murder. Stop, have evidence, stop, send federal backup to yo Salvation Creek, stop, they're coming for me, and the town, stop." Cross, it was a risk, sending a telegram that could be intercepted by Kane's allies, but Cross needed federal law enforcement to know the truth about Hawthorne's death. If something happened to him, at least there would be a record of who was really responsible. Cross paid for the telegram and headed for the livery stable where he'd left his horse. The animal was tired from the hard riding of the past 2 days, but there was no choice but to push on toward Salvation Creek. As he rode out of Silver City under cover of darkness, Cross couldn't shake the feeling that he was riding toward a final confrontation. Kane and his men would be coming for him, backed by the resources of the Territorial Development Company and probably several corrupt officials. But they'd also be facing William Cross on his home ground, surrounded by people who'd learned to trust in both his faith and his guns. The question was whether that would be enough to save them all. Cross reached Salvation Creek just as the church bells were ringing for Sunday morning service. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become a fugitive to protect his congregation, and now he was returning just in time to lead them in worship one last time. The townspeople gathered around him as he dismounted, their faces showing relief mixed with fear. Word had spread about the Army patrol and the charges against him, but they'd chosen to stay and wait for his return rather than scatter to safety. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Tom Bradley asked. "I found the truth," Cross replied. "Judge Hawthorne was killed by a man named Robert Kane who works for the Territorial Development Company. They've been using murder and intimidation to steal land throughout the territory. Can you prove it?" Cross pulled out the silver button and explained what he'd learned in Silver City. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, especially when combined with the overheard conversation in the saloon. "There's more," Cross continued. "Kane's men are coming here probably today. They want to eliminate me before I can expose what they've done." The congregation absorbed this news with the stoic courage of frontier people who'd faced danger before. These weren't city folk who'd run at the first sign of trouble. They were farmers, ranchers, and merchants who'd carved lives out of hostile territory through determination and mutual support. "How many men?" Sarah asked. "At least 6 that I saw, probably more. Professional killers with good equipment and backing from powerful people." Tom Bradley spat in the dust. "So we're outgunned and outnumbered." "Probably. But we have advantages too. We know this ground, we're fighting for our homes, and—" Cross gestured toward the church behind him. "We have something worth dying for." The next few hours were spent in preparation. Cross organized the townspeople into defensive positions, with riflemen posted in the church bell tower, the general store, and several houses with good fields of fire. Women and children were moved to the strongest buildings, while men who could shoot took up positions to cover all approaches to the town. It wasn't a professional military defense, but it was the best they could manage with the resources available. "Reverend," Tom Bradley said as they checked ammunition supplies, "what happens if we don't make it through this? What happens to the truth about Judge Hawthorne?" Cross had been thinking about the same question. "I sent a telegram to my old partner in Santa Fe. Federal marshals should be investigating Kane and the TDC regardless of what happens here." "Should be. But will they?" It was a valid concern. The Territorial Development Company had enough political influence to suppress investigations and buy off officials. Even with Cross's evidence, justice wasn't guaranteed. "Then we better make sure some of us survive to tell the story," Cross said grimly. The attack came just after noon, when the sun was at its highest and shadows were shortest. Cross spotted the dust cloud first, riders approaching from the south, too many to be anything but trouble. "Here they come," he called from the church bell tower. 8 riders, heavily armed. The approaching men made no attempt at concealment. They rode straight down the main street like an army of occupation, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. Cross recognized Kane immediately, a tall man with gray hair and expensive clothes, sitting his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. The riders stopped just outside rifle range, and Kane's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "William Cross, I know you're in there. Come out and face justice for murdering Judge Hawthorne." Cross climbed down from the bell tower and walked to the front of the church, his hands resting on his gun. "I didn't kill Hawthorne, Kane, but I know who did." Kane's laugh was cold and mocking. "Really? And who might that be?" "You. You killed him to steal his blackmail files and cover up the TDC's crimes." "Prove it." Cross held up the silver button, even though Kane was too far away to see it clearly. "I've got your button, Kane. The one you lost when you broke into Hawthorne's safe. And I've got witnesses who can place you in Silver City buying weapons and planning murders." For the first time, Kane's confidence seemed to waver. He conferred with his men in voices too low to be overheard, obviously debating their next move. "Even if that's true," Kane called back, "it doesn't matter. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Surrender now, and I'll make sure your people aren't harmed." "No deal." Cross replied, "You'll have to come and take me." Kane's men spread out to surround the town, but their movements were cautious. They'd heard stories about William Cross's reputation with a gun, and even 8-to-1 odds didn't guarantee an easy victory against a man of his skills. The siege began with sporadic rifle fire, both sides testing each other's positions and trying to gauge their opponent's capabilities. Cross's people had the advantage of cover and defensive positions, but Kane's men had superior weapons and unlimited ammunition. "They're trying to wear us down," Tom Bradley observed as bullets splintered the church door. "Keep us pinned down until we run out of ammunition or make a mistake." Cross nodded. It was a sound tactical approach, but it also gave the defenders time to think and plan. Kane's men were professionals, but they were also overconfident. That overconfidence might be their weakness. "Tom, can you get to the general store without being seen?" "Maybe. Why?" "There's dynamite in the storeroom, left over from when they blasted the well. If we can get some of it positioned right." Tom Bradley grinned fiercely. "I like the way you think, preacher." As the older man slipped away to retrieve the explosives, Cross continued directing the defense from the church. His congregation fought with the determination of people protecting their homes, but he could see they were taking casualties. Mrs. Henderson had been grazed by a bullet, and young Billy Santos was bleeding from a cut on his arm. The turning point came when Kane's men tried to rush the general store, thinking it was lightly defended. Three of them made it halfway across the street before Tom Bradley's dynamite charge exploded, sending them flying in different directions. The explosion also set fire to an abandoned wagon, creating a smoke screen that allowed Cross to move between positions without being seen. He used the confusion to work his way around to Kane's left flank, where two gunmen were trying to find an angle on the church. Cross's approach was silent and deadly. His first shot dropped one man instantly, while his second wounded the other badly enough to put him out of the fight. That left Kane with only 5 men, and one of those was injured. Kane. Cross called from his new position. You're down to 5 men, and I'm just getting started. Last chance to surrender. The response was a burst of rifle fire that sent Cross diving for cover behind a water trough. But he'd accomplished his goal. Kane's men were now looking over their shoulders, worried about attacks from unexpected directions. The final assault came just before sunset, when Kane apparently decided that waiting any longer would give Cross's allies time to arrive. All 5 remaining men charged the church simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the defenders through sheer aggressive action. It was a mistake. Cross had been waiting for exactly this kind of desperate move, and his people were ready for it. The crossfire from multiple positions caught Kane's men in the open street with nowhere to take cover. 3 of them went down in the first volley, while a 4th was wounded so badly he couldn't continue fighting. That left only Kane himself, crouched behind an overturned wagon and firing wildly at anything that moved. Cross walked out into the street, his guns drawn but not yet aimed. It's over, Kane. Your men are dead or wounded. Give up. Kane rose from behind the wagon, his expensive clothes torn and dusty, his face twisted with rage and desperation. You think this ends here? The TDC has resources you can't imagine. They'll send more men, better men. Maybe, but you won't be leading them. Kane's hand moved toward his gun, and Cross's reflexes took over. His draw was faster than thought, smoother than silk, deadlier than poison. 2 shots, fired so close together they sounded like one, took Kane in the chest and dropped him in the dusty street. Silence settled over Salvation Creek, like a blessing. The gunfight was over, the immediate threat ended, but Cross knew their troubles were far from finished. As the townspeople emerged from their defensive positions to tend the wounded and count the cost, Cross walked over to Kane's body. The man was still alive, blood frothing on his lips as he struggled to speak. The files. Kane gasped. Hawthorne's files there. But death claimed him before he could finish the sentence, taking his secrets with him to whatever judgment awaited killers and thieves. Cross searched Kane's body and found a leather portfolio containing documents that proved the TDC's involvement in land fraud, murder, and political corruption. Combined with the evidence from Judge Hawthorne's house, it was enough to bring down the entire criminal network. Is it really over? Sarah asked, appearing at Cross's side. This part is. But there will be trials, investigations, probably more attempts at revenge. Cross looked around at his battered congregation. I should leave, take this evidence to federal authorities, and let you folks get back to your peaceful lives. No, Tom Bradley said firmly. This is your home, preacher. These are your people. We'll face whatever comes next together. Cross felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. For 3 years, he tried to escape his violent past by burying it beneath layers of faith and good works. But maybe the real lesson wasn't that violence was always wrong. Maybe it was that violence in service of justice and protection of the innocent could be a form of worship too. All right, he said. I'll stay. But don't expect the sermons to be quite the same after this. Tom Bradley chuckled. Preacher, I think we can handle a little fire and brimstone in our Sunday services. Might even do us some good. As the sun set over Salvation Creek, Cross walked back into his church to survey the damage. Bullet holes in the walls, broken windows, splintered pews. It would take weeks to repair everything. But the foundation was solid, just like the faith of the people who'd fought to defend it. Cross opened his Bible to prepare for the evening service, knowing that his congregation would gather despite the danger they'd just faced. They'd learned that faith wasn't just about prayer and hymns. Sometimes it was about standing up to evil with courage and conviction. And sometimes it was about accepting that a man could serve God with both a Bible and a gun, as long as his heart remained pure and his cause was just.